about 1900 hours, January 12, 1950. The Thames estuary is a black void. HMS Truculent is surface running. She is a T-class submarine returning to Sheerness. She is home. Then the darkness hardens into steel. The Swedish tanker Divina drives her ice-strengthened bow into the submarine's starboard side. The collision is not a scrape, it is a structural amputation. This moment marks the beginning of one of the worst post-war Royal Navy submarine disasters. The cause of the impact is a fatal failure of night recognition. Divina is carrying a petroleum cargo, and under the local requirements for the Thames approaches, she shows an additional red light associated with that danger. In the clutter of shore glow and moving traffic, that extra red light collapses into a single false cue. On Truculent's bridge, it reads as an anchored contact, something to pass close and clear, so the commander alters course to port. Only when the bearing keeps tightening do they understand the truth. Divina is underway and closing fast. The submarine turns across the tanker's bow. The result is kinetic inevitability. The tanker's bow is reinforced for breaking ice in the Baltic Sea. It acts as a massive cold chisel. It strikes the submarine forward of the control room near the hydroplanes and torpedo stowage. The pressure hull integrity vanishes instantly. The sea rushes in with the force of a hydraulic ram. Truculent does not glide to the bottom. She is hammered down. Within minutes, she rests on the bottom about 9 fathoms, roughly 54 to 60 feet, below the surface. Now the physics changes from collision dynamics to hydrostatic survival. The majority of the crew is still alive inside the aft compartments. The water outside is freezing. The pressure is nearly 24 pounds per square inch. To survive, they must execute a compartment escape. This is a terrifying equalization process. They cannot open the hatches against the weight of the ocean. They must flood their own compartments until the internal pressure matches the external sea pressure. Only then will the physics allow the escape hatches to swing open. They use Davis Submerged Escape Apparatus, DSEA, the Royal Navy's hooded oxygen-breathing escape gear. These are self-contained breathing loops designed to lift a man to the surface. Discipline is the only thing keeping them alive. The men flood the hull, they equalize the pressure, they open the hatches, they float up through the black water one by one. The gear performs exactly as designed. This should be a story of miraculous survival. It is not. The Thames estuary is not a static pool. It is a conveyor belt of freezing mud moving at nearly 5 knots. It is an ebb tide in winter. The men surface into total darkness and are immediately swept out to sea away from the collision site. The rescue vessels cannot see them. The cold stops their hearts before they can be found. Only 15 are recovered alive, 10 by Divina's boat and 5 by the Dutch ship Almdik. 64 men perish. They do not die in the crash. They die drifting in the dark. The submarine now lies in the mud. The dead are gone. The hull is a massive steel obstacle in one of the busiest waterways in the world. The Navy cannot leave it there. They need to lift a T-class hull of roughly 1,300 tons surface displacement, and far more once flooded, plus the suction of Thames mud. But standard cranes cannot handle this load. The wreck of HMS Truculent presents a problem that goes beyond simple tonnage. The obstruction is only the surface issue. The real danger is inside. Forward tubes and stowage still holding torpedoes, turning the salvage plan into an ordnance operation. The salvage team is not just lifting a ship. They are lifting a submerged minefield. To assess this risk, the Navy deploys divers to the riverbed. They descend into an environment that is biologically and physically hostile. The depth is only 54 feet at low water, but the conditions render the concept of depth irrelevant. The Thames estuary is a churn of suspended sediment. It is a thick, moving solution of clay and silt that blocks all light. This is zero visibility. In clear ocean water, a diver uses sight to orient himself on the wreck. In the Thames, sight is useless. A powerful lamp pressed directly against a diver's faceplate produces nothing but a brown glare. This constraint forces the divers to adopt a technique known as Braille diving. They cannot see the damage. They must feel it. A diver lands on the steel skin of the submarine and crawls along the hull using his hands as sensors. He must locate the jagged metal lips of the breach by touch. He must identify specific valves and pad eyes by the shape of the bolt heads and the texture of the steel. He builds a mental map of the wreck in total darkness while the tidal current tries to rip him off the hull. Every movement is a calculated risk. If he gets snagged on a piece of torn plating, he cannot see to untangle himself. The survey reveals the submarine's attitude. She is lying on the bottom with a severe list. The collision has driven her bow into the clay. The mud of the Thames is cohesive and sticky. It creates a suction effect that acts as an additional anchor. To lift the Truculent, the engineers must overcome not just the dead weight of 1,290 tons of steel and water, they must break the suction seal of the riverbed. This brings the engineering challenge into focus. A standard crane lift involves pulling from the surface, but a surface crane is subject to the rolling action of the waves. If a crane ship rolls while holding a tensioned wire attached to the submarine, it will transmit that shock load down the line. It could jerk the wreck violently. With the torpedoes inside, this dynamic instability is unacceptable. A sudden jolt could trigger a detonation or snap the lifting hull. The lift must be perfectly vertical and perfectly smooth. The Royal Navy realizes they do not have a ship capable of this delicate brutality. Their standard salvage pontoon system is too slow and weather-dependent for this exposed location. They need a machine that can lift huge tonnage with hydraulic precision in a seaway. Ironically, the only vessels in Europe capable of this job do not belong to the British. They belong to the enemy. The Truculent was built to fight. The solution to the British salvage problem arrives from the losing side of the war. To lift the Truculent, the Admiralty deploys two massive floating machines named Energie and Ausdauer. These are not standard Royal Navy vessels. They are heavy salvage craft built by the German Kriegsmarine. Just 5 years ago, they were enemy assets designed to recover U-boats from the floor of the Baltic Sea. Now they serve the nation that captured them. They are prizes of war, repurposing their immense lifting power for a former adversary. These vessels are unique in their design. They are not simple barges with cranes bolted to the deck. They are purpose-built lifting platforms. Each vessel features a massive open stern and a high gantry system that allows them to straddle a wreck or operate in tandem. In tandem, they could apply about 1,200 tons of active stern lift and far more in passive lift using buoyancy and tide. This number is critical. The Truculent weighs nearly 1,300 tons submerged plus the unknown weight of the suction from the Thames mud. The German ships have the raw muscle to break that seal. But muscle alone is dangerous. A mechanical winch fighting against suction can snap cables or tear steel. To lift the submarine safely, the engineers rely on a technique that uses the planet itself as the engine. This is the principle of the tidal lift. It is a method that converts the vertical rise of the ocean into lifting force. The process is a sequence of hydraulic synchronization. First, the Energie and Ausdauer are positioned directly above the wreck site at low tide. The crews then flood the internal ballast tanks of the lifting vessels. This adds weight and forces the ships to sit lower in the water, pressing them down towards the river surface. While they are in this depressed state, the divers below secure the lifting wires to the submarine. The crews on the surface winch these wires bar tight, removing all slack. Then they wait for the cycle to turn. As the tide begins to flood into the Thames estuary, the water level rises. Simultaneously, the salvage crews pump the ballast water out of the lifting vessels, increasing their buoyancy. The ships want to rise. The ocean pushes them up. Because the wires are locked tight, the ships cannot rise without taking the Truculent with them. The submarine is not jerked off the bottom by a machine. It is floated off the bottom by the inevitable geometry of the tide. This method transforms the lifting vessels into hydraulic jacks. The ocean provides the power stroke. The ships act as the pistons. It is slow, silent, and immensely powerful. It eliminates the shock loading of a crane and ensures that the volatile torpedoes inside the hull are not subjected to violent acceleration. However, this system relies on one non-negotiable constraint. The connection between the lifting ships and the sunken hull must be absolute. The Energie and Ausdauer can generate the force, but they cannot apply it if they cannot grip the smooth steel cylinder of the submarine. There are no lifting eyes on the Truculent strong enough to take this load. The salvage team cannot weld onto the hull because of the explosive risk. They cannot drill into it. They have the lifting engines ready, but they have no way to attach them to the load. To solve this, they must thread steel needles through the mud itself. The mathematics of the recovery demands a precise connection. The engineers calculate that a single point of lift would be catastrophic. The hull of HMS Truculent is long and relatively fragile. If lifted from a central point, the ends would droop and the keel would snap under its own structural weight. To bring her up intact, the lifting force must be distributed evenly along the length of the vessel. The plan calls for 4 separate lifting slings. This creates a number shock for the logistics team. They do not need ropes, they need steel tendons. Each lifting sling is made of wire rope with a circumference of 9 inches. These are not flexible lines that can be tied in knots. They are massive, rigid bars of twisted steel. Handling them requires winches and mechanical muscle. The total weight of the rigging alone is measured in tons, but having the wire is only the first step. The hardest problem in marine salvage is placing these wires under a ship that is already burying itself in the seabed. The submarine is resting in a bed of thick, cohesive clay. There is no tunnel underneath the keel. The divers cannot dig one by hand because the mud would simply collapse back into the trench the moment it was cleared. To solve this, the salvage team utilizes a technique known as sweeping. This is a method that uses friction and geometry to saw through the riverbed. 2 tugboats position themselves on the surface, one on the port side of the wreck and one on the starboard side. They connect a thinner cable known as a messenger wire between their sterns. They allow this wire to sink until it drapes over the submarine's hull. Then the tugs begin a coordinated, alternating movement. One tug steams forward while the other backs down. Then they reverse the direction. This seesaw motion drags the messenger wire back and forth across the top of the submarine. The wire acts like a serrated blade. It slices through the clay alongside the hull. As the tugs continue their dance, the wire cuts deeper, following the curve of the bilges. Finally, it saws its way underneath the keel. The tension on the line tells the tug masters when the wire has passed completely under the vessel. Once this pilot line is established, they use it to haul the massive 9-inch lifting cable through the mud tunnel. This process is repeated 4 times. It is a slow, blindingly difficult operation. The divers must then descend into the liquid sandpaper darkness to verify the positions. They use their hands to ensure the wires are not fouling the hydroplanes or the propellers. They are working by touch, checking the tension and the angle of the steel loops. They are building a cradle. The 4 wires will act as a basket supporting the submarine from below. But the environment of the Thames estuary is not finished with the Truculent. Just as the rigging phase intensifies, the winter weather collapses. Severe gales sweep across the lifting site. The water becomes too rough for the Energie and Ausdauer to hold their stations. The salvage master is forced to suspend the operation. The ships disconnect and retreat to shelter. This creates a brutal pause in the timeline. The wreck is left alone in the dark for weeks. This delay carries a heavy psychological weight. The 64 men who died are still inside the hull. For the families waiting on shore, the delay is agonizing. The bodies are sealed in a steel tomb 54 feet down, waiting for the weather to break. On the surface, the operation is paused by force, not choice. The storm dictates the timetable, and everyone ashore is left counting hours that cannot be bought back. When the gales finally subside, the team returns to a changed river. They must reestablish the connection. The ends of the 4 9-inch wires are recovered and heaved up to the lifting decks of the German vessels. The slack is winched in until the wires are singing with tension. The cradle is set. The German lifting machines are now physically bonded to the British wreck. The trap is set for the submarine. All that remains is for the moon to pull the water up. March 14th, 1950. The operational window finally opens. The Energie and Ausdauer are holding station above the wreck. The 4 steel slings are taut. The ballast tanks are empty. The tide turns, gauges climb, the lifting craft begin to rise, and the wires hold the submarine in a grip that will not slip. For several minutes, nothing happens. The lifting vessels sit low in the water, fighting the immense drag of the riverbed. The tension on the gauges climbs into the red zone. Then comes the breakout. The suction of the clay fails before the steel of the wires. With a dull, heavy shudder, the hull of HMS Truculent releases its grip on the bottom. She lifts clear of the mud. She is hanging in the water column, suspended in the wire cradle. The salvage team does not attempt to tow the submerged wreck directly to the naval base. The risk is too high. If a wire snaps in deep water, the submarine would plummet back to the bottom and might break apart or detonate the sleeping warheads in the tube. Instead, they execute a tactical move to a staging ground. They tow the suspended mast 4 miles to a shallow sandbank known as Cheney Spit. Here, they gently lower the submarine back onto the seabed in shallow water. This is a controlled grounding. At low tide, the conning tower and the casing break the surface for the first time in 2 months. The submarine is no longer a ghost in the dark. She is a visible steel island. This staging area allows the engineers to change their method. They are no longer fighting the blind hostility of the deep channel. They can now access the hull directly. The priority shifts from lifting to sealing. Divers and surface teams attack the damage. They must patch the massive gash on the starboard bow where the Divina struck. They weld steel plates over the breach. They seal the vents and the induction valves. Once the watertight integrity is restored, they hook up high-capacity salvage pumps. They begin to pump the water out of the flooded compartments. As the internal weight of the water decreases, the submarine's natural buoyancy returns. She begins to float on her own lines. She is no longer dead weight hanging from the German cranes. She is a ship again. On March the 23rd, the final phase begins. The Truculent is taken under tow for the last leg of her journey. She is moved from the sandbank to the mouth of the Medway. She approaches Sheerness Dockyard. The journey is slow and somber. The salvage ships Energie and Ausdauer flank her like pallbearers. They guide the battered hull into the dry dock. The caisson gate is closed behind her. The powerful dockyard pumps begin to drain the basin. As the water level drops, the full extent of the damage is revealed to the dry air. The submarine settles onto the keel blocks. The mud of the Thames is still caked on her hull. The salvage operation is technically a complete success. The ocean has returned what it stole. But as the water recedes, it reveals the final grim reality of the disaster. The submarine is open, the 64 men are accounted for. The physical engineering challenge is over. Now the legal and forensic analysis must explain why a brand new submarine with a trained crew ended up on the bottom of the river. When the basin finally empties, the wreck is no longer a rumor in black water. In dry air, the wound has geometry. The damage is no longer a tactile map in a diver's mind. It is a jagged seam of ruptured plating. The breach on the starboard bow is catastrophic. The impact of the icebreaker bow crushed the pressure hull ribs and severed the electrical arteries of the ship. But the hardest work that follows is not measurement or steel, it is the human accounting inside the compartments. The interior of the submarine is a frozen capsule of the moment of impact. The salvage teams move through the compartments with reverence. They recover the 64 men who did not survive. As they work, they uncover the physical evidence of the escape. The hatches are open. The lockers for the Aladdin escape sets are empty. The breathing apparatuses are gone. This confirms the grim paradox of the disaster. The escape system did its job. The men did theirs. They executed a textbook escape from a sunken submarine. They defeated the pressure, they defeated the panic, they made it to the surface. But the system failed to account for the hostility of the river itself. They conquered the physics of the deep only to lose to the chemistry of the cold. With the dead recovered and the evidence secured, the Royal Navy convenes the inquiry. The verdict is a shock to the maritime community. The court attributes 75% of the blame for the collision to the Truculent. The Swedish tanker Divina is found to be largely faultless. She was displaying the correct lights for her cargo. She held her course as required by the rules of the road. The inquiry identifies the root cause not as incompetence, but as a failure of recognition. The red over white light combination was ambiguous in the complex visual noise of the Thames estuary. The submarine commander made a rational decision based on a fatal optical illusion. To ensure this geometry trap never kills again, the Admiralty issues a new fleet order. They mandate a structural change for every submarine in the Royal Navy. From this point forward, when a British submarine is moving on the surface at night, it must display an additional all-round white light at the very front of the bow. This extra beacon creates a distinct visual signature that cannot be mistaken for a stationary vessel. It immediately identifies the length and aspect of the ship to other mariners. In the service, it becomes known simply as the Truculent Light. It is a safety feature written in the blood of 64 men. The ship herself does not survive the verdict. The structural damage is too severe to justify repair in a post-war economy. The Truculent is stripped of her reusable equipment. Her brass and copper are salvaged. In May 1950, she is sold for scrap. The steel that was lifted from the mud with such immense effort is cut apart and melted down. The salvage of HMS Truculent remains a landmark in marine engineering. It proved that heavy tonnage could be recovered from zero visibility conditions using the tidal lift method. It validated the use of ex-German lifting craft which would go on to serve the Royal Navy for decades. But the true legacy of the operation is not the metal that was recovered. It is the small white light that burns on the bow of every British submarine. It is a permanent warning signal ensuring that the confusion of that January night is never repeated.